Chapter 2 of the Boy Scouts in the Rockies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Gaghan. The Boy Scouts in the Rockies by Herbert Carter. Chapter 2. Tidings of the Lost Mine. Help! Help! Smithy's tumbled over the edge of the precipice. That was Step-Hen shouting. He had happened to be the nearest one to the unfortunate scout when Mike gave the other an impatient shove with his nose that made Smithy lose his balance and topple over the brink. Thad never lost a second, but went on to the jump toward the spot where the stubborn Jack stood, with his sturdy little legs braced like steel, as though determined not to be pulled over just because Smithy had stepped off the trail. Reaching the spot, Thad threw himself down on his face. He could peer over the ledge and see the dangling scout. Smithy was squirming at a tremendous rate, doubtless terrified at the sudden mishap that had overtaken him, and which came when he was dreaming of other things. "Stop wriggling like that way, Smithy," called the patrol leader. "It won't do any good, and may shake the rope loose from your wrists here. Now try and get a hold with your other hand and grip it. Good and fast. We'll have you up in a jiffy, never fear." "Oh, Thad!" gasped the poor fellow, whose face was as white as chalk when he turned it up appealingly upward. Nevertheless, Smithy had learned the quality of obedience, and particularly when he heard the acting scoutmaster speak, so that almost mechanically he groped around with his free hand until his fingers came in contact with the taut rope, where they closed upon it tenaciously, just as a drowning man will cling to the nearest thing he clutches that seems to hold out a single ray of hope. "Here, let me help you," said a quiet voice to Thad's ear. He knew that it was Allan who spoke. Allan, always self-possessed and cool, even in the most trying conditions. Thad was only too glad to have an assistant, for he could never have lifted the imperiled lad alone, since Smithy was no lightweight, and did not know enough to help himself by digging the toes of his boot into the crevices of the rock, so as to ease the terrific strain on his arms. "Hold on tight, Smithy. It's all right, and you're not going to fall. Understand that. Now, so up you come, my boy. Another pull like that, and we'll surely have you on deck. Again, easy now with that rope back there, Step-Hen. Hold to the mule, and keep him quiet, will you?" Thad said all this in a reassuring, matter-of-fact tone that was better calculated to put confidence into the faint heart of Smithy than anything else could do. Step-Hen and Davy Jones caught hold of the ornery Mike, almost frantic because of those strange carryings-on, and held him tight so he might not interfere with the critical work of the rescue. And so Smithy was finally pulled over the edge. Once Thad managed to secure a grip of the collar of his scout coat, he knew everything was serene, for that khaki cloth was firm and sound, and capable of bearing almost any strain. The rescued scout sprawled on the shelf, panting hard. His face was still ghastly white, for Smithy lacked greatly in fortitude, and needed building up as much as the other tenderfoot Bumpus had before his adventure in the big timber that had gone so far as to raise him in the estimation of his chums. "Wow, that was a close shave!" exclaimed Giraffe from the rear, where he had been holding on the other mule with more or less difficulty, because when Molly discovered that her mate was in some sort of panic, she also wanted to frisk around and cut up, after the way mules acted in general. Step-Hen and Davy Jones were poking their heads over the edge, curious to know just what Smithy had been saved from. The former turned and grinned. "Guess you might have been bruised some, Smithy, if you'd gone on down," he remarked. "But there's a big shelf that was waiting to grab you, just 5 feet under your toes. But as you didn't know that, and thought the drop was half a mile, more or less, I don't blame you for feeling shaky about it." Smithy recovered sufficiently to insist on crawling to the edge, and also peering over. And when he really found that what Step-Hen had said was the truth, it seemed to annoy him, strange to say. "Now isn't that provoking?" he declared, in his precise way of talking that he had learned from his maiden aunts. "Why, if I only been aware of that circumstance, what an amount of mental suffering it would have saved me, when a fellow gets such a fright as that. He likes to know that it was worth while." The journey was soon resumed, but Thad saw to it that someone else besides Smithy held the leading rope of the tricky Mike. Perhaps a mule might never afterwards try the same game, And then again he was liable to break out in a new direction, for there was a little demon in that wicked eye of his, Thad thought. Already they were on the downward grade by the time night arrived. The guide hoped they would have reached the lower canyons, where a camp might be made. All the boys were really tired of climbing about among so many dangerous narrow paths, and would welcome the coming of time when they could move around without constant danger of being dashed to death over some precipice. None of them claimed to be born mountain climbers. They preferred to take their fun in some other way. When the route changed somewhat in its character, so that the little party could gather more together, an animated conversation broke out. The guide was fairly flooded with questions concerning the country, and what he knew about its past. "I've been all through here many a time," Toby declared, waving a hand to cover the surroundings generally. "And some other fellers. They'd just been fairly haunting these regions in years past, but 'twain't any use, so they never could find that old mine again." "What's that?" demanded Step-Hen, scenting an interesting item, for he was always on the lookout for such things as seemed to promise a touch of mystery. "A mine? What kind was it, Toby? Who lost it, and why haven't they been able to find it any more?" asked Giraffe eagerly, while Bumpus crowded closer, for he had a little mercenary streak in his make-up, and a chance to lay by another store of hard cash that might ensure a succession of glorious outings for the Silver Foxes. The guide seemed nothing loath to tell what little he knew. "Why, you see, thar was a man named Rawson. Met him a lot of times myself, and one time, after he'd been poking around in this section prospecting, he came to Greeley with his pockets just bulging out with the richest silver ore ever seen. All he'd said was he'd struck a lode that was mighty nigh the pure stuff. Then he went away to try and get up a company to work his mine, they says, and he never come back. Nobody ever knew whatever became of Rawson, but heaps of folks had hunted high and low to find his rich mine. Why, there was an old miner, Colonel John Kraken. I just reckon he spent as much as 4 months several times up around here, poking in the most unlikely places you ever heard tell of. They says how he was so dead sore on finding that same lost mine that he nearly went dippy over it." "And nobody's ever managed to locate it again since that so many days years ago? Is that what you mean, Toby?" asked Thad. "So she seems, Mr. Scoutmaster," replied the other, who was always giving Thad his full address when addressing him. "Bumpus, what in the wide world are you chuckling at back there?" demanded Davy Jones. "Don't you know Bumpus enough," laughed Allan, "to guess that already he sees the wonderful Silver Foxes discovering that lost silver mine, and just grabbing handfuls of cash right out of it to pay the expenses of the next trip? Where's it going to be another time, Bumpus? Down to the Gulf, cruising, or along the Mexican border? For you know scouts should never go outside the borders of their own country." "Well, why not?" demanded the fat boy, defiantly, looking back at the stunts we've carried through so far. "And tell me if it would be so very strange if we just happened to drop in on this old hidden mine of the Rockies. And I'm ready to shake hands with anything that needs cleaning up. You just wait and see if I'm so far off, that's all. And just think of his name being John Cracker. Now what boy could ever keep from twisting that around and calling him Cracker Jack?" chuckled Giraffe. "That's a good one, all right," declared the guide, laughing heartily. "And I'm some surprised, I am, that nobody ever thought to put that same on the colonel afore this. I wish you could have seen him, boys. Why, he's as fat as "You needn't look at me that way, Toby," burst out Bumpus, instantly, for he was more or less touchy with respect to his size. "I'm a taperin' down right along these days. Why, I don't reckon I weigh within 3 pounds as much as I did when we said good bye to Cranford." "And you lost all that time when you walked and walked for days hunting for your bear," put in Davy Jones. "Well, I got him all right, didn't I? Tell me that," asked Bumpus, proudly, as he patted the double-barreled 10-gauge Marlin shotgun, which he insisted on carrying across his shoulder, while most of the others were satisfied to secure their guns to the back-packed saddles. "You sure did," replied Davy, willing to give honor where honor was due. "I was just a-going to say the colonel, he's as fat as all get out," Toby went on, a twinkle in his eye telling much he really enjoyed these little skirmishes between some of his chargers. "But all the same, he's the most energetic critter you ever seen. And temper, says he's get as red in the face as a turkey buzzard, strutting around with a chip on his wing, ready for a fight. I expect some day the colonel will just blow up and disappear in a cloud of steam. And perhaps after all you might get a chance to set his eyes on him yet. Because I heard down at Greeley last time I was thar that he passed through with a couple of fellers and packs. So it looks like he meant to give that pesky lost mine another whirl. Making perhaps the 4th time he's been up this a ways. Glad to hear it, spoke up Bumpus. Makes it more interesting to know that he's still got some faith in the story of the lost Ralston mine. But I'm really sorry for Colonel Cracker, because he's a back number since the Foxes have come to town. And if he knows what's good for him, he'll go away, back, and sit down. It's refreshing just to hear you say that, Bumpus, declared Allan. He's just talking for the fun of hearing himself, that's what, grumbled Step-Hen. What sort of chance would we have, a lot of greenhorns who never yet saw a silver mine, against an old-timer like him? For one, I'm not going to take any sort of stock in the yarn, like it's not just one of those thousands of lies that are circulated all through the mining regions. I've heard there are just about any amount of wonderful lost mines here that never existed. My dad says, except in the mind of some crank. And my dad ought to know, because he owned stock in heaps of mines that was salted dreadfully, just to sell the innocent people in the East. About this Ralston, who's said to have found the silver lode that was nearly pure, Thad remarked, wishing to pick up more information. What sort of man was he, Toby? You said you used to know him once, I believe. Pretty fair and square sort of prospector, and they says how he was that tickled over his rich find, saying that now his family could enjoy some of the comforts of old life. Seemed like his first thought was about them, but I never know where he lived, except that it was somewhere down in Utah among the Mormons. Thought to be sure he wasn't belonging to the plural wife colony. Not much, seemed to think. All the world about the one wife and the children he got. Then it's too bad poor Ralston never lived to profit by his discovery, went on the scoutmaster. If he'd only been able to handle the key to his find over to his family, they might long ago have come in for a fair share of the profits of the lode. Well, Bumpus, if, as you seem to believe in that stubborn way of yours, that the Foxes are just bound to tumble into the lost mine, we'll remember, boys, to hunt up the family of Ralston and let them share in our luck. And now, as the afternoon is getting along, we'd better be thinking of hurrying if we want to camp in the valley this coming night. They made a little spurt, though it was always next to impossible to hurry those two independent pack animals, as contrary by nature as anything could be. Step-Hen indeed declared they would do well to turn the animals around and pretend to want to go in the other direction, but Mike and Molly would keep on backing up until they reached the valley below in good style. The sun was, of course, out of sight behind the mountainous wall, standing like a great barrier in the west, when the little company of scouts finally reached the base of the eastern ridge. "There's a hunky campsite just over beyond that bunch of trees, boys," the guide announced. "Plenty of good drinking water for a man and beast, too. So let's head that way. Reckon you all must be tired with that long trip across the range." 5 minutes later, and they drew up at the spot which they had immediately saw was just the place for pilgrims to pass the night. "Hello, there's been a fire here," exclaimed Giraffe, always on the lookout for anything that pertained to a blaze, for he was the greatest fire worshiper ever known. The guide flung himself down beside the ashes and felt of them, while the scouts wanted to hear what his report would be. "Why, somebody camped here just last night," declared the forest ranger, quickly. "And like it or not, 'twar that old Kenneth Cracker and his party, bound to comb these mountains once more, looking for the lost silver mine." End of chapter 2. Recording by Kenneth Sergeant Gaghan.